and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue him from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth, without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns towards the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And it grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning. Man, it's so good to be here together in person in the midst of all of these crazy times going on together. It feels like a lot has happened since even last Sunday. It feels like a lot in our culture and timelines and news feeds. A lot to process. And so how good and how sweet to be together as God's people together sitting under His Word this morning. So we had an election, and so that was kind of a big deal. A new president-elect, which, some people I saw literally in my neighborhood out celebrating in the streets. And then other people are really fearful, really scared, really angry about the results and contesting the election. And that's really hard. That's hard for us. That's hard for churches. That's hard for people across the country. We've also seen an alarming spread of COVID-19 in our community right now, which is really pretty crazy. There were yesterday over 6,000 new cases in the state of Michigan, which is crazy, right? There are lockdowns coming into effect around the world right now, and that's scary, right? I mean, this is going to affect not just those people out there, but people in our church and in our community, and this is going to come home to us, and it's going to be pretty challenging. And of course, with the talk of lockdowns and all of those things, right, we have all these economic fears and concerns that are with us. And so these are crazy times. I think we can all acknowledge that. And so it's fitting that we are in the book of Daniel, and we've left behind the familiar stories and have entered the bizarre world of apocalyptic dreams and visions. So we're in kind of a bizarre time, and we're reading these bizarre biblical prophecies. And you might be wondering, what possible relevance could any of these bizarre dreams and visions here in Daniel have for our lives today, for this cultural moment in which we find ourselves? But what I want you to see is that this apocalyptic literature in the Bible, these big, bold, bizarre, scary dreams and visions, were actually written for times just like ours. Right? Daniel's dreams and visions were written down for times of unprecedented disruption, nations rising and falling, widespread suffering, and even state-sponsored persecution. Those were the kind of contexts and situations into which this biblical book has spoken hope. These dreams and visions have spoken hope into hopeless situations to countless generations of Christians. And so this morning I'm hoping that we can wring some great comfort and hope and encouragement out of this book, as well as we study these beautiful and bizarre and fascinating apocalyptic dreams and visions. So hang with me. I think you're going to find these to be very relevant to the place which we find ourselves. The big question we're tackling this morning is, as Christians, how do we deal with a full-blown existential and historical crisis? When we're in moments of crisis, personally and culturally, what do? How do we respond? The book of Daniel is speaking exactly into that kind of crisis. And so we're going to be wrestling with, how do we respond to a world in crisis? And to answer that question, I want to look at first the existential crisis, that personal crisis we all feel when we're in the midst of a crisis, how we personally respond. We're going to look at the historical crisis, the broader historical, cultural situation in which this happens. And then we're going to close with the hand guiding human history. So the existential crisis, the historical crisis, and the hand guiding human history. And my aim is to offer comfort, courage, and hope for these confusing and disorienting times. So let's start with the existential crisis here. I want to start this morning by looking at Daniel's personal response to the dreams and visions that he is receiving. Right? So in chapters 1 through 6, we see almost superhuman wisdom and courage from Daniel, right? As Daniel confronts Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, we see a man who is unfazed by kings and emperors. He's unfazed by lions. This guy gets thrown into the lion's den, unfazed, totally unmoved. We look at this man and we go, wow, what an incredible model of faith and courage and conviction. The guy just doesn't seem to flinch under any of the pressures that we've seen him under in the first 6 chapters of this book. We're impressed. We want to be like Daniel. Wouldn't we all want to have the kind of poise and courage that Daniel has in difficult times and difficult moments? But in chapters 7 through 12, we get a much more human Daniel, right? As Daniel is given glimpses into the future of what's going to happen to his people, we see that he is anxious and alarmed. He's overwhelmed and appalled. And so as we dig into the text here, if you flip it last week, and I skipped over these last week, but wanted to cover them this week. If you look in Daniel 7:15, we read these words, "As for me, my spirit," this is Daniel, as he's seeing these visions, "as for me, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me." So Daniel, first couple 6 chapters of the book, incredibly courageous. The man is unfazed. He's wise. He knows how to handle all the difficult challenges. Here in the second half of the book, all of a sudden we see a Daniel that's anxious about the visions that he sees. He's alarmed by what's going on around him. Even Daniel, this incredible model of faith, this beautiful guy who models what it looks like to follow God under difficult situations, he's alarmed. In 7:28, if you look at the end of chapter 7, we read these words, "Here is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me. My color changed, but I kept the matter at heart." So here's a man of great courage again. He's like, man, I can handle standing before kings. I can handle getting thrown to the lions. He can handle the crises of his own time and moment. But he's like looking forward at these visions that are to come. He's freaking out. He's not just alarmed. He is greatly alarmed by the things that he sees in these visions and dreams. And then, of course, we come to our own text this morning. By the time we come to the end of chapter 7, end of chapter 8, after reflecting on all of the things that we just read about in the scripture reading, we read, "And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it." I love how Eugene Peterson paraphrases this in the Message. He says, "I, Daniel, walked about in a daze, until unwell for days. Then I got a grip on myself and went back to work, taking care of the king's affairs, but I continued to be upset by the visions. I couldn't make sense of it. And so you have this vision of Daniel right in those first 6 chapters, courageous. He always has the right words. He always has the wisdom to say. But as he's looking forward at these vistas of the future, persecution, hard times, nations rising and falling, he's now alarmed. He's worried. He's anxious. He's appalled by the things that are going to happen in this world. And while Daniel does get a grip on himself, I love how Eugene, he gets a grip on himself and he gets up and he goes to work, after the election, after pandemic. He's still able to get up. I love it. He's like, I'm still getting up. I'm going to get a grip on myself. I'm going to go back to work. I'm not going to be weighed down by all of the anxiety, but it gets him, right? This stuff is finally getting to him. The crisis around him, the challenges, the difficulty, just this constant uncertainty, disruption is finally getting to our hero in the story. And I want to start there because I think we can all identify with Daniel. I'm sure at one point or another during the midst of this pandemic or election season or race tensions in our country, you have just been, anybody been anxious, alarmed? Any of you been overwhelmed? Any of you been concerned by the implications of the things that are happening in our country and world right now? This is where Daniel finds himself, right? He does really well through the first 6 chapters, but it's like enough. And I don't know how many times I've said that, like, not another wave of COVID coming, like not in the middle of the winter when we can't even go outside and we're just going to be trapped in our houses forever. This is going to be terrible, right? I don't know if you've been there, but I certainly have. And I think this is how we respond, right? In the midst of a crisis, right? We're human beings and we all respond pretty predictably. We get alarmed, we get upset, we get overwhelmed, we get angry. And I want you to see the Bible doesn't present like a superficial response to suffering, right? The Bible is deeply in touch with our experience of suffering. And even heroes of the faith like Daniel are overwhelmed by the brokenness in the world we see around us. And not only Daniel, but even your pastor, right, can be overwhelmed by the brokenness in the world around us. As I'm trying to be present with those of you that are here and we've got masks on and we're trying to socially distance and it's just weird, right? I mean, trying to do life and community as we've always done it. And it's even weirder for those of you that are watching this in your living rooms right now. So many of you are staying home. Some of you I know are sick right now, wrestling through this virus. People are struggling right now. And it's even harder as a pastor to be able to pastor people that I can't be physically present with and trying to reach out and connect over Zoom and text messages and Instagram messages and all of those ways in which we digitally communicate in this day and age. It's been really hard. It's been really difficult. It's been hard, man. We're so excited to be moving forward. We hired a new associate pastor. We're like, yes, we're going to reach the lost. We're going to plant more churches. We're going to buy an awesome building. Like, we're going to do some incredible stuff. And then it's like, but we're in the middle of a pandemic and there's all this uncertainty. And we're trying to figure out, God, what are you trying to teach us as leaders of a church walking through a season like this? I don't know, what is it for you as you're thinking? Obviously, pastors, Daniel has his fears and concerns. Pastors have their own fears and concerns in a season like this. What's it for you? What's your greatest fear for 2020 as you look at the pandemic, as you look at the economic implications, as you look at the toll for relationships and loneliness and sickness and all of the things? I just want us to start there with this challenge. What is your greatest fear in 2020? I'm convinced that we need to wrestle with this because we're not going to really get much. We're not going to move from fear to freedom. We're not going to be able to make much progress in our lives if we can't identify and be honest about the fears in which we are facing. And those fears are going to be different for all of us, right? Some of it's fears about work. Some of it's fears about school. Some of it's fears about kids. Some of us are fearing loss of freedom and liberty to just be able to do and live and be who we are. Some of us are fearing, the disease and, all of the, anxieties that are going on there. We all struggle in different ways. And the Bible invites us, right, shows us, models for us what it looks like, even for heroes of the Bible, to wrestle through the fears that we have so that we can bring the gospel to bear, bring the hopes of the gospel to bear on our fears. We got to bring them into the light if we're going to address them, if we're going to find hope and healing, courage and resilience, and all of those things that the Bible wants to forge in us during seasons of suffering. But we got to be honest about our fears. First, we got to be able to wrestle with our greatest fears. And I love how Daniel models that for us as he's looking forward at these great visions of the end. So we're all well aware of the political tensions, right, in our own culture, the racial tensions, the COVID tensions, the economic tensions. What are the historical realities in Daniel's world? Now, for some of you, you're going to be really stoked that I'm getting into the historical details of the text, and some of you are going to be like, oh gosh, why are we going into this bizarre vision? Hang with me here, okay? I think you're going to find that even the historical details of Daniel's text are going to be helpful. They're going to be important for you, right? You know, because this is where we live in history, right? This is where Daniel was at. He was at a moment in history working with the challenges, the uncertainties, and difficulties, and we, of course, find ourselves in our own little moment of history wrestling with a lot of the same fears and concerns and anxiety. So we looked at the existential crisis for Daniel. Now I want to look at the historical crisis. Let's set this crisis in its historical context. And I want to do that briefly, and I want to invite you up front to come talk to me afterwards and ask more questions, because Daniel is just full of questions. And I'm full of answers, but I'd be up here for 3 hours if I were lecturing through all the minutiae of these great prophecies. So I'm giving the overview and inviting you to ask any further questions you might have. So Daniel's vision is a crisis of historic proportions for God's people, right? He sees a vision of 2 more beasts, this time a ram. So get this in your mind. You got to do some imagination. If you're a kid out there and you've got a pen and your pencil, you can do some doodling here. It's great to be able to try and capture these visions here. So we got a ram on the one hand, and he's got 2 horns, and we've got a goat on the other end, a male goat with 1 giant horn. So you got 2 beasts. Again, we had 4 beasts last week, 2 beasts this week. We got the ram, and we've got the male goat. The 2-horned ram conquers all the opposition. It tramples, defeats all of its foes. Nobody seems to be able to stop this 2-horned ram until a goat comes charging across the land, not even touching the ground, takes this ram out, kills it, tramples it to death, and totally destroys it. So we've got this epic battle of the beasts once again playing out in Technicolor, in comic book-like imagery, so you can sketch it out, draw it out. If you have an imagination, bring all of your imaginativeness to bear on this situation. So after the goat defeats the ram, the one with the great horn, that great horn is broken off, and then 4 lesser horns emerge. One of them, lesser horns, is going to go on a rampage. And I don't know how horns go on rampages, but it does. It goes on a rampage in Israel and the temple in Jerusalem, totally trashing all of the temple precincts. So you got these out-of-control beasts. They're running amok here. One's going to run amok in Jerusalem in the temple itself. And then in verse 13, the angels join the psalmist in crying, "How long, O Lord? How long is all of this tribulation and desolation going to happen?" And of course, we all have asked that question probably many times during this whole crisis and pandemic. How long, O Lord, are we going to be stuck here? And of course, the enigmatic answer is 2,300 mornings and evenings, which is fascinating. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So the interpretation of this vision is given in verses 20 through 26. So we're not left to just totally imagine what exactly is going on here. We get a key to help us understand the text here. As for the ram that you saw with the 2 horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. So pretty familiar empires that we've been dealing with in the course of this series. And the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken in place, of which the 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face and one who understands riddles shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction. He'll succeed in what he does and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes. And he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that have been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And so the interpretation of this vision lays it out once again. The beasts represent nations, right? The rams, the Medes, and the Persians. The goat is the Greeks. And the great horn is Alexander the Great, who conquered Persia historically, if you're familiar, in an incredible lightning war across the world. The Greeks emerged victorious over all their enemies, but then Alexander the Great died at the age of 33, very young, and his kingdom was split into 4 different empires. We know this historically. Those 4 different empires or 4 different kingdoms were ruled by his 4 different generals, and one of those kingdoms will viciously persecute God's people under a king called Antiochus IV. He would come into Jerusalem like a wrecking ball with a plan to impose by force Hellenistic culture on the Jewish people. And he would implement a series of persecutions unlike any God's people had ever seen before. In 167 BC, he outlawed the temple, all the things happening around the temple, the priesthood. He assassinated the chief priest, outlawed and burned all the Torah scrolls in the land. He forbade circumcision on pain of death. He brought a sacred object dedicated to the god Zeus into the temple, which the Jews in the first century called the abomination that causes desolation. And he sacrificed a pig on the altar. So he did everything he possibly could to outlaw Jewish worship in all of its forms. Temple worship, the sacrifices, circumcision, everything to make it impossible for God's people to worship their God in the ways that the Torah had instructed them to do. This was one of the greatest persecutions in Israel's history, and that persecution under Antiochus IV becomes characteristic of the work of Antichrist under the Romans and down through history until its final manifestation before Jesus' return. And so you have the spirit of Antichrist at work persecuting God's people in the person of Antiochus, a very historical referent, but also in the Roman empires who were persecuting God's people, burning them as torches in Nero's garden, and all of these reflections of Antichrist we've seen throughout history, trying to persecute God's people. And so you're probably wondering, what practical purpose could this bizarre vision possibly have for your life? And I want to say it's actually pretty obvious. It's actually a lot easier to face persecution and suffering if you have been warned. And what Daniel has been given a warning of not imminent persecution, but persecution that's coming over the next couple hundred years for God's people. Let me give you a simple illustration here that maybe could bring this down to earth a little bit, because this is pretty bizarre and out there. I lived in Florida for several years as a youth pastor while I was finishing up seminary. And if you know anything about Florida, right, they have really bad hurricanes, right? But they had this incredible early warning system. So when we were down there, I was really hoping, like, we're going to get a hurricane, and just to be able to say I've lived through a hurricane and how exciting it is. So we had a really big tropical storm bearing down upon us, and I was like, whoa, this is so cool. And of course, they give you all this day's warning. So we put the hurricane shutters up, which are pretty much like metal plates over the windows so nothing can go through. You stock up your food and water, and you have all these supplies. And then you just kind of hang out and, happily ride out the storm. And then afterwards, you take all your food, and everyone has huge barbecues, and because everybody's power's out, so you just got to use all your meat. So everybody's cooking and barbecuing, and it's great. And so if you have that early warning, it's easy, right? You put up all of the precautions that you need to take, you hunker down for the storm, and then afterwards you have a big party. And that's kind of how it works. Whereas if there was no early warning notice and you get a category 4 or 5 hurricane, your house is going to get blown apart, right? People are going to die. But if there are early warning systems in place, right, you can face that hurricane with relative ease, right? I mean, those Floridians, it's amazing. I mean, they're prepared. They got the shutters, they got the, all the building process, everything is in place to handle some of these big storms that come. And that's exactly what Daniel is trying to do. He was trying to give us an early warning prediction of persecution and trouble, tribulation that would come. And he's not the only one to do that. Of course, Jesus said the very same thing throughout the gospel. Here's a few selections. John 16:33. In this world you will have tribulation, but take heart. I have overcome the world. Or in John 15:20. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they'll also persecute you. And throughout the gospels, Jesus warns us, right, that there is going to be challenges. There's going to be persecution. In this world, we are going to have trouble. So be warned. If you think, when I become a Christian, everything is going to be great. Nothing bad will ever happen to me. I'll never get COVID. My candidate will never lose an election. I will never lose my job. Life is just going to be wonderful to me from here on out. That's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible doesn't give us any of those promises and assurances. The assurance that the Bible gives us is that through all those things, whatever happens in our lives, God will be with us. We can expect tribulation. We can expect trouble. We can expect trials, but God is very much with us. And Daniel wants to encourage his readers who are going to be living under the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans to be ready for all the tribulation, persecution, trial that is coming so they can be prepared to face it with great courage and great resiliency and great faith, which they remarkably do, preserving their traditions all the way down through the coming of Christ. And so what comfort, courage, and hope does Daniel offer to his readers here in chapter 8? Because obviously he's just given us some pretty dire crises, both of a personal nature, an existential crisis. He's given us a historical crisis, the persecution of God's people, which is pretty crazy. What hope does he offer for us as this chapter concludes? And I want to close here with the hand guiding human history. This is so important for us to see in the midst of the crises we face. We need to be reminded that there is a hand guiding human history. Notice what Daniel says about this king who dares to persecute God's people in verse 25. I love the conclusion of this prophecy here. And he shall rise, this is verse 25, by his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. Isn't that fascinating? What is this mysterious supernatural hand here in the middle of our text? Who is this hand that's going to emerge and defeat the forces of evil in the world? We know it's no human hand, right? It's not going to be a human king, a politician, some superhero, some celebrity that steps on the scene. No, this is nothing less than the hand of God intervening in the affairs of human history. The rescue of God's people during the time of Antiochus IV, the rescue of God's people under the Romans, and the ultimate rescue of God's people from the forces of Antichrist at the end of time, all come from God's own hand. His hand is ultimately the one guiding human history, and we do very well to remember that in times like this, right? We need to remember that it's not our hand, it's not our ability, it's not our ingenuity, how smart we are, how clever, how prepared we are, but to be reminded that God's hand is guiding history in the rise and fall of kingdoms, viruses, elections, everything that's going on. We have a God who is firmly in control. But I think there's more to this mysterious hand guiding history. We know from back in chapter 7 that the key figure in bringing God's kingdom into history is this mysterious divine human figure, the Son of Man, that we read about last week in chapter 7, 13 through 14. We read of this figure, verse 13, I saw in the night visions, this is chapter 7, verse 13, behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, was presented before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, and all peoples, nations, languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. At the center of the book of Daniel in chapter 7, at the center of human history, is God's rescue and God's redemption coming through this mysterious divine human Son of Man, who we all know in hindsight is Jesus, right? The one who called himself the Son of Man over 80 times in his own ministry. And so we can conclude from that the hand guiding human history is a hand that is a nail-scarred hand. The one who gave his life in exchange for ours is the one guiding human history. And so we can trust him, right, with the crises that we see around us. With what's going on in the world, pandemics, the rise and fall of politicians and political parties, all of the challenges, the ups and downs of life, we have a Savior who has come to give his life for us, and so that we can count on his presence with us and for us. I love how Paul sums this up in Romans 8:31 through 32. He says, "What then shall we say to these things? Right? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things?" Isn't that amazing, right? If the God who gave his own son in exchange for us is the God who's guiding human history, right, we can be confident that he has good plans for us, even in the most perilous and disorienting of times. So what would it look like to trust that God's hand is guiding history this week? I have three practical suggestions for you for remembering that God's hand is in fact guiding human history. First off, I can assure you that our culture will not be reminding you, right? Cable news, Netflix, social media, right? Disney Plus, they're not gonna be informing you that the hand guiding human history is in fact a nail-scarred hand. So you're going to have to be really intentional about reminding yourself daily, right? You're going to have to be spending time in Scripture. Throughout this series, we've recommended spending time in the Psalms, maybe a psalm each day, morning and evening. We've talked about set times of prayer, maybe establishing into the rhythms of your day, set times to just be spending some time in God's presence, being reminded that he is in fact in control. There's some other great resources. There are podcasts out there. Many of you are digging podcasts into them, just spending some time reflecting on who God is, what he's doing. Redemption City Church has got a new podcast, which is pretty cool. You can dig into that. There are some incredible books out there that can bring great comfort during times like these. The elders are reading through a book called Gentle and Lowly by Dane Ortland. The Heart of Christ for Sinners and Sufferers. Highly commend that to you. And of course, the beauty of Christian community, people that can remind you of who God is and what he's done. Second, are we leaving space to process, right, our fears and anxieties before God and others, right? Our culture talks a lot about self-care. It was amazing to me, people's elaborate election preparations, right? The comfort foods they were going to eat, the cocktails they were going to mix, all in preparation for the shock and trauma that might follow if their candidate lost. Chocolate chip cookies, It's amazing to me the ways in which people were thinking about self-care for the election. I would just encourage us to up our game from self-care to soul care, to be thinking about how are you spending time processing your fears and your anxieties before God, and then finding some safe people in your life that you can be processing those fears and anxieties with together as well. It's so crucial, so valuable at Christian community to give us that space to process all the fears and anxieties that we're going through right now. And then finally, last suggestion, read some great biographies that give you some historical context for people who've lived through crazy times like ours. Read Corrie ten Boom's The Hiding Place. Read about her courageous stand against the Nazis that landed her in a concentration camp and her amazing resilience walking through all of that. Read William Wilberforce's epic battle to abolish slavery in Amazing Grace. Right? What an incredible story of a man who spent his entire life in one cause through incredible suffering and incredible adversity, all to bring about this incredible end to slavery in Great Britain. Read John Perkins' inspirational story about faith overcoming racism, oppression, and injustice in the Deep South, and Let Justice Roll Down. There are some incredible biographies out there that as you read them, you go, man, people survived times worse than ours. People were able to find their faith was resilient and strong, that God met them in remarkable ways. Biographies are a beautiful way to be reminded, right, that we can make it through this. Like God's people have suffered throughout history and continued to be faithful to Christ. God's met them in the midst of their suffering. I want to close with Jesus' words, again in John 16:33. Probably more than anything else, this simple verse sums up the message of chapter 8. Jesus says, "In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart. I have overcome the world." What a beautiful, beautiful reality for us to fix our eyes on. And it sets up communion for us beautifully this morning, right? To remember that Jesus himself experienced great tribulation, right? He was falsely accused, given an unjust trial, sentenced to death on a cross, right? All for our sin in our place, right? Jesus' body shed for us, Jesus' body broken for us, Jesus' blood shed for us. And he overcame sin and death and Satan so that we could enter into the freedom that he has for us this morning. And so for Christians, we get to celebrate what Jesus has done, that he has conquered sin, death, and Satan, and he offers freedom from fear and from anxiety and from all the things that weigh us down. So we get an opportunity this morning as we gather around the Lord's table, or at least take out those little things with the little wafer and the juice, and be reminded that Jesus' body has been broken for us, his blood shed for us, so we can enter into the peace that he offers, the comfort that he offers, find courage and resilience for the times in which we find ourselves. If you're not a Christian, this time around the Lord's table is not for you. The meal is not for you. It's not going to help you. But we do want to invite you to reflect on what is your greatest fear, right? How are you addressing it? How are you working through it? And most importantly, who is walking through it with you? We have this incredible Father in heaven as Christians. We have this incredible family called the church that we get to walk through this season together. And if you're not a Christian, we just want you to be a part of that. We want you to experience that for yourself. So I invite you to reflect on that. I'm going to pray, and then I'm just going to invite those who are followers of Jesus to just spend some time reflecting on who Jesus is, what he's done. And then we'll close with a final song. So Father, we thank you for Jesus. We thank you for the reality that the hand guiding human history is a nailed, scarred hand, that the one who gave his life for us is the hand guiding human history. Would you make that real to us this morning? God, as we pour out our hearts about our anxieties and our fears and all the cares that we have, knowing that you care for us, would we meet your comfort, your peace, your courage for the times in which we find ourselves? And we pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.